Meanwhile, as Dr. Reich has implied, many of the new jobs that are being created are low-wage jobs, service industry jobs. That's the problem. Now, I would just mention for the record that Vermont, my state, has the third highest minimum wage in the country, and that is $8.60 an hour. We also have the fourth lowest unemployment rate in the country. And I would just say for the record, I have really not heard almost anybody suggest that raising the minimum wage to the level that we have in Vermont has been an impediment to our economy, which is doing reasonably well.
Partisan agency. But the report it released yesterday about the effects of raising the minimum wage was seized upon by both sides of the debate. Among its findings, if the minimum wage were raised to $10.10 an hour, it could eliminate 500,000 jobs. But it would also lift 900,000 families out of poverty and raise incomes for more than 16 million people. The report noted there could be significant variation in the numbers. AFL-CIO. And David Newmark. He's an economist at the University of California, Irvine. He's done extensive work on this subject. And we welcome you both to the program. Thea Lee, to you first, what is your main takeaway here? That on the one hand, the Congressional Budget Office is saying, yes, it lifts people out of poverty, it'll raise incomes, but it has the potential to eliminate.
Notice it's the AFL-CIO here. Are they just representing minimum wage workers out of working class solidarity? Or is there something more to the story, like the minimum wage prices low-skilled workers out of the marketplace, which increases demand for high-skilled workers like their members?
Jobs.
Well, there were some good findings out of the CBO study. As you said, 16.5 million people getting a pay increase, which is long overdue, and about 900,000 coming out of poverty. The most controversial finding in the CBO study was that up to 500,000 people could lose their jobs because of a hike in the minimum wage. But if you look carefully at the CBO study, they haven't actually done new research. And I think it was a little bit biased in the sense that they gave a lot more weight to studies that might have a negative employment impact and less weight to a vast consensus among economists right now that, in fact, raising the minimum wage will have little or no adverse job impact. And I think those studies have been
a vast consensus? I don't think that's accurate.
More of the newer studies, more careful studies that have been done, and that's where a lot of the economics profession is right now.
Professor Newmark, what is your takeaway on what the CBO said, and how do you respond to what the Elijah said, that it really didn't take into account the consensus of economists? She said that there won't be this effect on jobs.
Well, let me take the first question in reverse. Let me take the question in reverse order. It's simply a misstatement of the research evidence to say that most studies point to no effects of minimum wages on employment. To say that there's a consensus among economists now, I don't know where that comes from. There's survey.
She made it up.
I did an extensive survey of minimum wage studies back in 2007 with co-author William Washer.
Minimum wages and employment, a review of evidence from the new minimum wage research.
We found that while there's definitely a dispute here, most of the evidence, 2/3 of studies and a higher percentage of the studies we think are better, point to negative minimum wage effects. There are a few recent studies that find the opposite. That's not new. There have always been a few studies that find to the contrary. There's been a
One of the problems with economics, unlike, say, the physical sciences, is that it's very difficult to conduct sort of laboratory experiments where you isolate one variable and then see how it changes in response to stimuli. Ultimately, what you're studying when you're studying when you're studying economics is the decisions made by individuals, which aren't static, which are responsive to conditions, and which are subject to any number of influencing variables. So it's you have to be very careful when looking at these studies, not to exaggerate the importance of one but to look at the totality of the evidence and to look at general economic theory and what it says about the impact of price controls on the markets they govern. Because the minimum wage is just one of any number of price controls that can be imposed on a market. This is on the labor market, but there's no shortage of incidents of governments instituting price controls and economists being able to observe them.
By, I'd say, the authors of those studies, as well as some people very in favor of raising the minimum wage, to make it seem as if that's what we know now and that's the consensus, but that's simply not the weight of the evidence. I really welcome the CBO study because I think what it does is it puts the discussion back where it should be. There are costs to raising the minimum wage. There are some benefits to raising the minimum wage. We should be having an informed policy discussion about what those costs and benefits are and how we trade them off against each other.
At the risk of coming off as a zealot and unhinged, I believe the benefits are quite dubious. The CBO talks about how the minimum wage. This is from some time ago, but it doesn't change the fundamental situation. Would raise people out of poverty, but from my understanding of the situation, that's simply not the case. The minimum wage is prohibitory, so raising the minimum wage doesn't actually raise anybody's wages. Yes, people will be receiving the minimum wage, but those people, probably a lot of them, would have been receiving this above minimum wage salary anyway, just from raises and what have you. So I think it's simplistic to say that this actually ends up raising anybody's wages. The law is prohibitory in nature.
The discussion arguing as if there's no cost, no disemployment effects of the minimum wage. Obviously, if there's no cost, that's all benefits, you might as well do it, and you might as well keep doing it higher and higher. So I think the CBO study puts us back where we need to be, saying there is some job loss, and let's think about that cost relative to the benefits.
I guess I wouldn't say there's no benefit. There might be some marginal benefits, just from like your salary isn't really adjusted that frequently. There's some inertia there, or some lag between when it's adjusted and your employer. If you're, if, let's say the minimum wage is set to like $11, and you have a productivity worth $10.50 or $10.25, that's your employer's estimate. They're not necessarily going to fire you. You might continue to increase your skill set to be worth that amount. There's a substantial risk involved in firing you and having to hire somebody else. That's an expensive process. They could hire a dud, and then they're out. Not only the wages they paid this dud, but also he might hamper production. You're not there playing the role you played. So it's a complicated analysis. And there might be some marginal benefits, but I don't think it's as simple as, looking at the number of minimum wage workers and saying, oh, they're all getting a raise, because we don't know where those people would be if the minimum wage hadn't been increased. Very few workers actually make the minimum wage, so most people make more than the minimum wage because they have a skill set worthy of that. So the people who are, if you raise the minimum wage to $15 to $17, or from $10 to $12, the people now making $12 2 years from now might have been making $12 anyway, is my point.
Thea Lee, without pitting studies against studies, how do you respond to the point that the professor just made, that it's important to acknowledge that, yes, there may be some benefits, but there are also some trade-offs?
Well, even in the CBO study, even if you take the CBO study at its face value, it talks about a $31 billion increase in income for low-wage workers. And these are folks who have been working hard, people who are playing by the rules, who are productive, who are going to work every day, and who can't lift their families out of poverty. So I think this study goes to something which is very important. This is a hot topic right now. The minimum wage, raising the minimum wage is incredibly popular.
And what about the workers, the low-skilled workers who are priced out of the marketplace for the minimum wage? I mean, these are people who desperately need employment, who could increase their productivity and hence their salary by working, by gaining experience, by gaining connections. What about those people? Where are they in the analysis?
It would be good for the economy. And in fact, it's good for a lot of businesses. And we're starting to see now that even businesses like Costco or the Gap just announced today that it's going to voluntarily raise wages for its workers, have found that some of the benefits of a higher minimum wage, that there's higher productivity, there's lower turnover, lower absenteeism. Workers are healthier, they're happier, they stay in the job longer. Those are all really important offsetting impacts that need to be taken into account. And that's why I think the new economic research, which isn't about theories, it's not about drawing a supply and demand curve on a blackboard, but it is about looking at historical, real-life situations where you have two states or two counties that are next door to each other, and one raises the minimum wage and one doesn't. And in those very carefully controlled studies, you do not find that there is a negative.
But there's a real problem with this methodology. If you're going to throw away economic theory, you're going to get lost in just staring at the data. You're going to get hopelessly misled. You need theory to guide your experiments, to guide your empirical analysis, or you're never going to get to the truth of the matter, if that's even your goal. You know, I mean, I don't want to call these people hacks, but they're hacks. They believe in the minimum wage, and so they devise studies that prove their case, quote unquote prove their case, even though it's not true. These are partisan hacks. The minimum wage has been a staple of the social democratic platform for almost 100 years now, almost 90 years now, and these studies just started coming out in like the 90s, you know, but it's the methodology. You look at like the famous Kreuger study, and the methodology is just garbage. So this is the famous Kreuger study, 1992, in New Jersey. There was a 20% increase in the minimum wage, which is not really that much. And what they did was they basically cold called a bunch of fast food restaurants twice, and they asked them, you know, did you fire anybody? They surveyed them as to the employment conditions. Let's see, does it have the... So here you can see the data, part-time employment, percentage of full-time employment, starting wage, price of a full meal. The problem with this methodology is that the predictions of the minimum wage opponents isn't that it'll kill the existing jobs, but it'll prevent future jobs from being created. A 20% increase isn't really that high. There's always a measure of subjective analysis when an employer is determining a worker's productivity. You can't know precisely what the value is. So there's a good measure of slack, and if a worker's earning $4.20 and you increase the minimum wage to $5, it's probably usually easier to just keep them on, maybe delay their next raise, and hope that, because workers tend to increase in productivity through experience, they get better with the machines and they know the situation better the longer they work there. So they're probably going to grow to that new close wage anyway. A lot of the time they'll have sort of accrued raises that haven't been paid yet, or they deserve raises based on their higher productivity. So maybe the difference isn't even the full 20%, maybe half. They've already improved their labor because they've been working there for about half that amount, the 40 cents of the raise. The other half, it's paid because they don't want to have to search for a new employee. That's an expensive process, time consuming. They might not find, they might hire a dud. So I don't think this is predictive. The data they're studying is really predictive of what you would expect to see. What you could look for is the quality of future hirees. That's a difficult thing to measure, but the theory is that basically employers are going to be more biased towards higher productivity employees. For example, let's say there is no minimum wage, and you've got a guy named Ted, and he works at a factory. He produces 5 widgets an hour for a wage of $5 an hour. Okay, there's another guy named Tom, and he works at the factory. He's twice as productive. He can make 10 widgets an hour, and he gets paid $10 an hour. So the marginal labor cost there is the exact same. It's $1 per widget, and the employer is ambivalent between hiring Tom and Ted. You might hire them both, for that matter. Now, if the minimum wage is set to $7 an hour, then the employer is going to hire the guy at $10 an hour with the $10 an hour productivity producing 10 widgets, because if he hires the guy that does 5 widgets an hour, his marginal employment cost is going to increase by 40%. The worker's productivity is not going to increase. His cost will increase by 40%. But if he hires the more skilled worker at $10 an hour, his marginal productivity stays the same. So the prediction would be that employers, with a substantial increase in the minimum wage, employers would start hiring more high-skilled, more experienced workers, and fewer entry-level, less experienced workers that can compete on the basis of wage. And also, maybe there's some hope that they can be trained to become a better worker.
From raising the minimum wage.
Well, David Newmark, you can respond to that, but even setting that aside, what about the positive that the CBO found, that poverty would be reduced, that millions of people would end up with higher income? The point that Ms. Lee just made, that people would have more disposable income.
Right. So very briefly, the studies I was referring to are not theory. They are studies of empirical evidence. So again, we can talk about the research and argue what's good and what's bad, but let's not just mischaracterize the research record. Why are we having this debate in the first place? We're having this debate in the first place because inequality has widened a lot, and because many people feel, and I rank myself among them, that in a country as rich as ours, the minimally acceptable standard of living at the bottom should probably be higher than it is. So that's the goal. How do we raise incomes of low-income families? The question is, what's the best way to do it? The minimum wage is generally viewed as not a very good way to achieve that goal for one simple reason.
This lady seems super out of her depth.
Minimum wages don't target poor and low-income families very well. Many families that are poor have no workers. Okay, so the minimum wage presumably does little or nothing for them. And many minimum wage workers are non-poor families. We have an earned income tax credit. Perhaps it should be more generous than it is. The earned income tax credit essentially adds on to your labor market earnings if you're in a low-income family, and it adds on more if you have children to give those families more help. Now, some people don't like that for reasons we don't have time to get into here, but I don't think anyone disagrees, people on both sides of the debate, that that's a much better and more effective and more efficient way to put money in the hands of low-income families. So when the CBO says...
I was just going to
Go
say,
ahead,
I want to
sorry.
give, we only have a little bit of time left. Thea Lee, what about this, that the point he's making, which has been made elsewhere, that there are better ways to get money into the hands of those who most need it?
I don't think we need to choose between the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is a good program, and raising the minimum wage. The truth is that if you're working for a living, you should not be in poverty. And I think what we need to do is give not just low-wage workers, not just poor workers, but middle-income workers a raise as well. Because the key factor in our economy today is that millions and millions of workers have been working harder, they're more productive.
I mean, it's great to want workers to have higher wages, but you can't just wish it. You can't just decree it by government fiat. There are rules of economics that you have to follow.
They're more educated than they've ever been, and they haven't had a raise in decades. So I think raising the minimum wage is one important way.
And I don't think that's true. I think that that wages across the board have been going up, albeit not super rapidly. For example, here's all employees, total non-farm workers. I believe this is in constant dollars. I'm sorry, that was the wrong graph. Here we go. Real hourly compensation for all workers, non-farm business sector. So that shows now this is all workers, so you're going to get like CEOs, managers, I think, in there. Pretty much everybody who's earning some sort of salary. So you could make the argument maybe that certain segments of the working workers have not gone on a raise. But certainly, if you look at real hourly compensation for all workers, there's a steady trend onwards and upwards, with a few zigs and zags, which is to be expected.
Of lifting up the floor for all of those workers, and I think it should be a top priority for the Congress and for the country.
Professor Newmark, just a brief response.
Well, I think that's that's a sentiment. We wish low-income people would earn more, but it's not as simple as that. If we could just wave our wand and they would earn higher wages, I would say that sounds like a great policy. But there are trade-offs, and this CBO study puts us back to seriously considering those trade-offs.
Professor David Newmark, Thea Lee, we thank you both. It's a tough debate. We'll continue to look at it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
David Newmark, what a boss.
50 years ago.